Hey guys, this is my tutorial presentation for week 2. Sorry that it was so late. I've been having a lot of technical difficulties, but I'll try and get right into it. So at first, I'd like to start off with an acknowledgement to country. We acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this land. We acknowledge the waterways, land, and sky, and all that inhabit this place. We acknowledge and pay respect to the elders, past, present, and to the future. Sovereignty never ceded. And no matter where you are in Australia, this is, was, and always will be traditional Aboriginal land. Guys, so the piece that I chose was George Stubbs's The Kangaroo from New Holland, 1772. Currently resides in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, London. Now, before I go into any more detail with the artwork or its historical significance, I would just like to start out by saying that although this artwork is considered the first visual representation of Australia and its inhabitants in the Western world, it is important to remember that Cook and other explorers' so-called discovery of Australia is quite problematic. Of course, we know that Indigenous Australians inhabited this land for what is understood as 60,000 to 100,000 years prior to European settlement. And of course, these artworks are not the first visual representation of life. We have evidence paintings, shields, cave paintings, to say otherwise. So yeah. So in the late 18th and 19th centuries, the world was being studied and described by Europeans on a scale that was never before seen. So the Enlightenment period really created ambitions to understand the world through empirical observation. It can be argued that although these images were meant to be objective, the cultural background of the creators is still evident. As people sought to comprehend the abundance of new and exciting worlds, it led to an intense scientific scrutiny. Exploration of the Pacific revealed unanticipated communities and environments as European voyagers obtained and recorded objects, artifacts, maps, and descriptions never before imagined by the people back home. In this period, visual imagery became increasingly important, far exceeding a written description in its ability to pick form, texture, color, and beauty of these new landscapes and creatures of the New World. So prior to James Cook's voyage to Australia, it is known that Dutch explorers began charting the east coastlines of Australia as early as 1606. So in 1703, navigator William Dempner included several engravings within his account voyage to New Holland. However, Cook's voyages from 1761 to 1776, he brought along all kinds of scientists and artists to record these strange creatures and landscapes of the New World. So this is where naturalist Joseph Banks comes in. He created many sketches of these new discoveries. You can see him there on the left. And he actually commissioned George Stubbs to recreate some of the alien-like undiscovered animals of Australia. So as I said, Joseph Banks commissioned George Stubbs to create or recreate images of these new animals that he found. So George Stubbs is a self-taught painter. He studied anatomy. His work is very distinguished, mainly in horses, for very high quality. And so he actually created lots of recreations of these creatures that came back from all of the lands in which were explored. So for the kangaroo, his primary source was sketches made by Joseph Banks, who accompanied Captain James Cook on his first voyage to Australia in 1768. The rough sketches, you can see it on the right compared to the actual artwork, were brought back by Banks with a hide of kangaroo, and that's all that Stubbs had to work with. Although his materials were quite scarce, the work did portray quite a great likeness. However, there is the issue of the scientific observation versus the neoclassical bias in regards to these images. The kangaroo is portrayed as quite small and then one would see in the wild quite dainty and a bit chubbier than your usual kangaroo. It really brings in the kind of Enlightenment tactics to portray these creatures of the New World in a more digestible format for the public back home. There's remnants of romanticizing these images for the public. Again, with these paintings, they're by no means anatomically perfect. However, Stubbs's dingo, you can see portrayed here, it looks more like a cuddly dog than the notorious vicious predator of the outback that we are so used to seeing. That's quite natural. So although they tried to attempt to recreate these creatures in a empirical way, the images are still looked through a colonial eye and outside a European kind of classical eye, and you can see in the sketch on the left it's still prevalent in some of these sketches with the classical movements seen also in sculpture when you compare. Although there is some evidence of colonial bias, these images prove to be crucial in the representation of Australia's so-called discovery during the Enlightenment eras, as European navigators attempt to record the flora and fauna objectively of these new lands. So these paintings are increasingly important to Australia. The National Gallery has attempted to obtain them from the possession of its owners. Unfortunately, they were outbid by the National Maritime Museum, but it really is an attempt to regain the narrative of Australia's colonial history. Lastly, I just want to finish on this video. I found it fascinating. The National Maritime Museum is attempting to recreate these George Stubbs paintings because of their unusual materials. The two images were painted in wax, and there is no oil binder, and it really hasn't been fully investigated as to how he applied the wax, but I find it fascinating to see how the pigments work being applied and then becoming an entirely different color when heated. But that's the end of my presentation, guys. I'm going to add some questions on the Wattle page. See you later.